Hi, everyone. It's Peggy again. This might be our last nice warm day of summer here in Washington State. It's just so beautiful. It's a little too warm in the middle of the day to go out though, so I'm glad I get to take a break from gardening and also from typing and just spend some time with you all. I was going to start with our sequel to Hinds' Feet on High Places, Mountains of Spices today. And I had it all prepared. And then just as I was to sit down, I picked up Hinds' Feet just to, for some reason, to see where we left off with Much Afraid as she was changed into grace and glory. And I see that the back of the book has lessons learned on the slopes of the high places. And it's quite lengthy, but I thought maybe it's not quite time to leave the Hinds' Feet on High Places. These are the lessons she learned, and learning to spend time with the Lord and communing with Him and listening to Him. So I think let's read from that today, and then next week we'll start on Mountains of Spices. And I read this again. I read Mountains of Spices years ago too, and I was looking at the first page, and it says, "To Peggy from Tony and Barb, April 1992." So my dear friends had given me this book back in 1992. So I must have read Hinds' Feet before that. So that's a long time ago. But I'll tell you, some of the lessons I learned too are still with me. Most of them are still with me. So let's stay with Hinds' Feet on High Places for one more week. So this is the lessons learned on the slopes of the high places that the author, Hannah Hurnard, has learned. I'm sure she's in heaven now. So this was written during a 3-week visit to Switzerland on her way back to Israel after a short visit to England following the death of her father and the winding up of his affairs. So she begins, "I had said farewell, as I thought, to the old home in which I had been born, and where I had been welcomed back by my father on all my furloughs from missionary work in the Middle East." That's what she did. "Come up to me to the mount," is this one. "The Brunwald, Monday, May 23rd, 1949. Can you imagine that? Way back then. That was actually before I was born. "And the Lord said, 'Come up to me into the mount.' And a cloud covered the mount, and the glory of the Lord abode upon the mount. And the cloud covered it 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud, and the Lord spoke." That's from Exodus 24, verse 12, 15, 16, and 25, verse 1. "Through mist and cloud, and by a strange path, where I could never see more than one step at a time, the Lord has brought me here to Switzerland, to a high mountain apart. I believe that he will speak to me out of the cloud, for I know he has something to say, and I long to hear it." Isn't that sweet and significant also? He always wants to speak to us. If we ever take the time to listen, he's always there, and he always has something to say to us. And so we do long to hear him. We long to hear his voice. And it's not always directions, do this, do that. Of course, it's love language, because he loves us. So I continue. 3 days ago, as I came up in the funicular railway from Linthal to Braunwald. In Glarus, there was such thick mist and cloud that nothing at all was visible. Not a chalet, nor tree, nor wall could be seen, and even the Bergenfrieden deaconess house was quite invincible until we reached the door. The sisters said that for over a week it had been very like that, and it might continue the same way for weeks longer. Humanly speaking, it was very disappointing to come to Switzerland after so many years' absence and be unable to see anything. But that evening, from my window in the huge wooden chalet, I saw one patch of rocky precipice and snow exposed for a few moments through the driving rain and mist. I had been told that the snow mountains rise in a glorious range just the other side of the valley, but I could never have guessed so from what was visible to me. Next morning, I awoke at 4:30 a.m., and there the mountains were. How right those people are who say that one might just as well not come to Switzerland unless one is prepared to rise before the sun. Now the mountains appeared. Still lying in bed, I saw them through the uncurtained window, their tops still buried in the cloud, but a glorious snow and rock range rising just like a wall across the narrow valley. All that day the mist was clearing, but the clouds remained low and still hid most of the view. The next day she wakes at 5 a.m., and lo, clear and rosy in the dawn light against a background of calm blue sky were the high places I so longed to see. Now I'm sitting on a huge green slope, starred with tiny blue gentians, and the buttercups are scattered like gold all around me. This is the Braunwald Alp, and the snow mountains rise like walls on 3 sides of it. I sit here and look out on the beauty beyond expression. To the right is an immense cliff over which the Brumbach waterfall leaps down with the noise of many waters. You notice a lot of these references already are referring to the things we read in the book, the allegories. Opposite me is a mountain with huge rock walls and 7 peaks rising one above the other. Beside them, though not quite so high, is another peak shaped like a horn. This 7-crested mountain is the Ortstock, and the horn is called the Hohler Turm. This is the mountain that dominates the scene in Braunwald, and it is more picturesque than any of the other neighboring giants. To the left rise great ramparts and ranges of snow and rock. While I sit here in brilliant sunshine, an immense dark cloud has overshadowed the heights, and I hear a distant peal of thunder. So through cloud and mist, I have come to the place on the mount where I believe the Lord is going to speak to me and reveal the reason why he has brought me back to the beloved Swiss mountains after an absence of so many years. I've always wanted to go to Switzerland. The Brumbach Falls. The whole neighborhood is filled with the sound of rushing water pouring down over and between the rocks. For me, the 2 falls, the Brumbach and the Zilbach, are 2 glorious angels of love leaping down from the heights to carry life and power to the valleys far below. That's what we read about in Hinds feet, didn't we? The waterfall going back to the valley of humiliation. She says, "Oh, my Lord, what do you want to say to me today? Help me to hear your voice. Teach me to understand the language spoken by your creation all around me. You see, that's one way the Lord can speak to us, is through his creation. If we open our eyes, open our spiritual eyes, our spiritual ears, and that means open our souls, our spirits to him, and he will speak. Help me to receive into my innermost soul the great truth that to whom much is given, of them shall much be required. Lifting my eyes, I look across the valley at the Brumbach Falls and see the water pouring itself in an extraordinary ecstasy of self-abandoned giving. And I know now that is the Lord's message to me. I've asked him to help me to understand the language of this book of nature. And the first lesson and message his creation utters is this one. It is so clear that I do understand it. It speaks of love's eternal, ecstatic joy in ceaseless, blissful giving. The first characteristic of true love is humility, the pouring of oneself down lower and lower in self-effacement and self-denial. The message of running water always is, go lower, find the lowest place. That is the only way to true fulfillment. And now it's not talking about saying, oh, I'm so humble, I'm going to be self-effacing. No, it's born out of love. When you love, you do come under others and support them and lift them up. That's love. It's not thinking about yourself and how humble you are. The next characteristic of love is giving. The poured out life gives life and power to others. The more love gives, the more it fulfills itself. For it is love's prerogative to give and give and give. The third characteristic of love is service. The Brumbach Falls, in the act of giving themselves, serve the whole valley and far beyond it. The water means a supply of irrigation, electricity, and light for many, many homes, gardens, and orchards. To be utterly abandoned to the goal of giving oneself to others and going down lower is the joy and ecstasy of love. That's what he did for us. He went as low as you can go. He gave himself for us. Perfect love casts out fear. Yes, that is what the water utters so exultingly as it rushes toward the great, terrifying rocky lip of the gorge and plunges over, utterly abandoned and unafraid of the dreadful depths into which it must fall, down onto the threatening rocks below. You see, there's no fear, even in this example from nature. It plunges over, utterly abandoned, and we can plunge in. If the Lord says, follow me, we can throw ourselves in and know he's going to take care of us. It doesn't mean everything is going to be easy. I'm not saying that. Remember when the shepherd planted the thorn of love into Much Afraid's heart, and he said, love is beautiful, but it can also be painful. Watching the waters as they leap over the edge and following them with my eyes as they fall downward, I discovered that the whole movement is one of the most breathtaking examples of utter rejoicing and of triumphant, almost delirious abandonment that I have ever seen. If one looks at the falls as a whole, they are marvelously beautiful. But if one gazes at one particular part of the water as it plunges over the lip and then watches as it falls right down, the almost crazy, blissful abandonment is staggering. I never saw emotion so utterly expressive of joy. The joy is in the abandonment. The movement looks like perfect rapture, fearless surrender to a hitherto unknown delight, the greatest it is possible to experience. The downward motion is light, adventurous, and perfectly happy. The water, after casting itself over the rocks, seems to be held up and supported as though floating down on wings. A glorious contradiction indeed. How can one abandon oneself in this way? Well, the scene before me answers this question. The falls come down from the heights. Before they can do that, there must first come the experience of He makes my feet like hinds' feet and sets me upon my high places. So this is the place where we left much afraid at the end of the book. One cannot, and that's from Psalm 18:33. One cannot get a mighty and powerful fall of water if there's only a low place and a short way for it to fall. It is the high places of faith and obedience which make the falls of love possible. So do you see that? Faith and obedience are the mixture that makes the love possible. The Ortstock, the great seven-pinnacled mountain opposite, is a wonderful picture of spiritual experience, rising from height to height and peak to peak. The summits of the high places are the powerhouses from which love pours itself down in joyful surrender. One can never truly love until by faith and surrendered obedience one reaches the high places, and there learns to go skipping and leaping on the mountains of difficulty as though they were an asphalt road. Now, isn't that difficult, you think? I mean, I've been learning that lesson for decades, I think. But now is the time for us to go skipping and leaping on the mountains of difficulty. Our difficulties are the Holy Spirit's opportunity. And if you've got to do it now, whatever it is. Everything around me seems to be designed to emphasize this lesson. I've been brought to a place where all God's creation appears to be uttering things in a language which only becomes clearly audible and understood by hearts that have been learning in the school of suffering. That is profound and true. I remember one time when I was suffering greatly with a 72-hour migraine, and all I could do was groan. And the Lord said to me at that time, I understand that language, Peggy. He understands our sighs and our groans. He understands all of that language. It is the language which one begins to spell out in one's innermost soul when one is on a cross to which self is being transfixed by nails of pain and anguish of heart. It compares to the experiences in the siege of Jerusalem and the years in terrorist-ridden Palestine, which led up to this past year in 1948. Have I not been brought here to experience some great readjustment in my spiritual nature? Instinctively, the old nature at once cries out, "Oh, will it be very painful? Hasn't there been enough of it already, dear Lord Jesus?" And then I laugh. Shall the clay vessel on the Lord's wheel and under his loving molding hands think of pain in the last stage of a long, joyous yielding to his patient fashioning? So you've yielded all the time where he's fashioning, the potter is fashioning you into a beautiful vessel. And then at the end, you say, oh, is there going to be much pain? No. Count the cost? Definitely, but count it at the beginning. The only thing that matters is that the adjustment of abandonment to selfless love be made perfectly, so that I stop seeking to be loved and abandon myself to the joy of giving love to others. That's the key right there. How beautifully someone has summed this up in the words of an old Quaker lady quoted to me. Self-sacrifice is the ecstasy of giving the best we have to the ones we love the most. The sound of falling water and the bells of the cows as they graze on the mountain slopes are the only things audible in this quiet valley. But the sound of the water is continuous. It never stops. It is saying over and over again, the secret of experiencing true love is to go lower. Pour yourself down. Go lower and lower. Give and give and give, and serve with joyful abandonment. Oh, my Lord, how I thank you. Next is the Cecilbahn. Yesterday morning, the Lord was teaching me the most fascinating lesson from the Cecilbahn. High above Braunwald, on the slopes of Eggstock, is the Ortstock House. It stands near a great precipice and is connected with Braunwald. Far beneath it, by the Cecilbahn, a system of overhead cables slung from lofty pylons fixed in the rocky slopes of the mountain. On these cables, cars are hung, which are electrically caused to slide up the cables carrying provisions to the Ortstock House. As I climbed the gentian-starred slopes to my usual prayer and trysting place with the Lord, I could hear the lines beginning to ring overhead, and I kept waiting to see the cars that would go swinging up those aerial lines to the heights far above. I was told that people, as well as cartons of provisions, could ascend in them. At last, at the end of the morning, I saw the aerial vehicle and got a shock. It was not a walled-in car, which came rolling down the cable, but just two chairs, similar to ordinary metal garden chairs, with a kind of sunshade cover fixed over them. There was no protection of any kind, just two chairs dangling in the air, side by side. In one of the chairs, a solitary man was sitting, with nothing underneath him but a narrow footrest fixed to the bottom of the chair. Apparently, he had been up the line testing the cables. In the evening, as I walked to the Braunwald Alp through a pine wood, I could see and hear that the Cecilbahn was in full swing. One after another, these fragile, completely unenclosed chairs went running up the cables, swinging over fearsome abysses and up the face of the mighty rock precipice. One after another, up they went, and down they came in a never-ending chain. At first I thought that ever so many people must be going up in them. And then, as I could see no one, I thought that they must be empty. But on the way home, I passed the lower terminal, or station, and saw the chairs swinging into the station shed, all of them quite empty. Then they reemerged a few minutes later with small boxes and crates strapped onto them. A never-ending chain of supplies was going up to the house on the heights, ready for the expected tourist visitors who, as soon as the mists cleared, would start making the ascent. It seemed to me then that the Cecilbahn was one of the loveliest and most fascinating pictures of faith imaginable. For faith has nothing to do with intellectual belief. Faith is obedience. Faith and abandonment to God's will and power are inseparable. So did we hear that? Faith is obedience. Faith and abandonment to God's will and power are inseparable. Faith is willingness to do God's will, unwillingness to abandon one's own will and to obey God is unbelief. There they were, those tiny chairs with no sides or backs, only a couple of bars. The cable by whose power they traveled overhead and at a great distance was quite invisible. Underneath there was nothing but the abyss and no earthly ground of support. All one saw was two moving chairs, apparently hanging in the air. But they were supported from above, just like we're supported from above. The power came from above, and by means of that power, they were able to travel upward in defiance of the law of gravity. They went higher and higher, fixed with a wheel which ran up one cable and down the other. One had only to be willing to trust the invisible power, sit down on a chair, and abandon oneself completely. No self-effort was possible. That's key. We're not talking about do to be. In other words, do something to get something, like Adam and Eve. Do something to try to get the glory, but they already had it. One had only to be willing to trust the invisible power. No self-effort was possible. Then one would be wafted upward to the heights. It was all a matter of faith and no works, except for the initial work of choosing to abandon oneself to the Cecilbahn. But oh, how terrifying that choice looked to me. I am so wary of heights and afraid that panic will send me crazily throwing myself down from the pinnacle. Remember, that's how she described much afraid when she was trying to climb the mountain. She thought she would panic and get dizzy and throw herself down. It is a fear that has assailed me all my life and kept me from climbing high mountains as other members of the family loved to do. What if the cable broke or the power failed? Nothing beneath except broken bones or death. No earthly support. I could only too readily imagine that any nervous person or someone afraid of heights would be appalled at the very thought of such a journey. True, there would be nothing to do but rest in the chair and be carried upward. But oh, how easy to get in a panic and make yourself fall. How like that overhead cable the promises of God often seem to be. They look so appallingly frail and unsafe and without earthly support of any kind, apparently leading to such impossible situations. It seems they certainly cannot be relied upon, for we tell ourselves how easily we may be mistaken and claim what was never meant for us personally, but only for great, courageous saints of God, prophets, and apostles. But once we abandon ourselves to these promises and enter into them in the abandonment of faith and obedience, then all the overhead power begins to work. The traveler, resting on and in the promise, does nothing but remain in it. Have you probably read or heard the only thing we should strive for is to strive to enter his rest? And that's what you would have to do to go on one of these chairs dangling in the air. Having trusted the promise enough to risk everything upon it, up one goes. And no power on earth can hinder arrival at the consummation of the promise and its perfect fulfillment. Though we may seem to meet the most horrifying precipices confronting us and abysses far below, which we could never hope to ascend nor pass over in our own strength, yet in the spiritual Cecilbahn of faith and obedience, everything is triumphantly surmounted. For an hour I watched quite fascinated, for my path led up the valley, high over which the chairs went swinging on their way to the heights above. And my Lord spoke to me and said, God is not a man that he should lie. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or hath he spoken, and shall he not make it good? That's from Numbers 23, verse 19. Fear not to journey onto all the tests and threatening difficulties in the area to which you are returning. As I was with you in the siege of Jerusalem, and though you think that you now have no home to which to return in England, yet I will be with you everywhere. I will lead you and in every circumstance in which you find yourself. Oh, yes, one may catch one's breath as one begins the challenging ascent in one of his promises, looking forward to what seems an awfully dangerous precipice. One may feel dizzy as one is swung across and over an abyss between two peaks, but the promises are sure, and trustfully sitting in them, one goes running up to greater things. Next is the torrent. Today I started to walk to the right Alp. There was lovely sunshine, and I made my way through the fields, rejoicing in all the beauty. The fields were golden with the most beautiful kingcups and dandelions, and tiny gentians like blue gems were everywhere. The Brumbach and the Zilbach falls faced me. I walked rejoicing as though in heaven, awed at the way all nature around me was sounding forth the utterances of God. You see, if we open our ears, we can hear all nature around us uttering praises and joy to God. Ever since going through the siege of Jerusalem in 1948 and being in constant danger of death, it seems that my physical senses have been quickened to enjoy the beauties, scents, and sounds of nature to a far higher degree than before. It is part of the legacy of joy and blessing which those terrifying experiences bestowed on me. In the old days, when I visited Switzerland as a girl, I used to be thrilled by the beauties of nature in a special way. I loved the scent of the pine woods, of the damp cones and needles carpeting the ground, the sawn logs and moss and lichen-covered rocks. But now it all means unutterably more. Find nature a book of marvels, the language of which I have just begun to understand and interpret. So I walked in ecstasy with natural beauties around me, speaking forth the praises and character of the Creator. You see, the creation expresses the character of the Creator. It's wonderful. Everything uttered his name. I came to the sawmill beside the torrent, which runs down the valley from the foot of the Brumbach Falls. The water which I saw rushing so blithely over and among the rocks and under the bridge was the same water which high overhead had come to a great crisis and leaped so exultantly and with such blissful abandonment over the falls. I stood on the bridge and looked at it. Yesterday I had asked myself, what does the water do when after its magnificent abandoned leap, it reaches the cruel rocks below, and there is no longer the ecstasy of leaping down, only a rough rock obstructed everyday course before it? On the bridge I saw and laughed to see what happens to the water. The bed of the torrent was strewn with huge rocks. There were obstructions everywhere, but the water came rushing along, laughing and rejoicing, and absolutely delighted to find its way over and around all the obstacles and difficulties. Oh, Lord, let that be. It seemed as happy and cheerful, forcing its way among the grim rocks, as when it threw itself down over the heights. What a lesson I learned as I watched it. I think almost the loveliest of all of them. Day after day, once the leap of obedience has been made, the power of the waters following along behind, added to the steepness of the riverbed, makes the surmounting of difficulties and obstacles of every kind a daily delight. See the power of the water behind and steepness. He knows how to make it so that we will make it. Then the meadows of flowers added their lovely voices, emphasizing the message of the rushing waters. They were so small and yet so brilliant. There were so many of them carpeting the fields, and apart from their beauty, in a way so unnecessary. I asked the Lord to help me to understand the message He wanted them to give me, and they simply chuckled and sang it to me. We are all our Creator God's extra loving kindnesses and tender mercies. We blossom beside the paths of obedience and all over the fields of life. He makes us flourish to give delight to anyone who may see us. Some people take us for granted, as though we are so common and ordinary that it is not worthwhile noticing us. They see no beauty to cause delight, but every worshiping, grateful soul thrills with awe and delight and wonder at the daily blessings and loving kindnesses of the Creator Father. Next is the Hostock and the Gentians. I walked perhaps for 3/4 of an hour to a place where the Ortstock mountain was behind me, and I seemed to be in a completely different environment. The 7 peaks no longer dominated the scene. Instead, the Riot Alp lay ahead, and all the other snow mountains were seen at a completely different angle. For the first time since my arrival, the clouds rose so high that for a few minutes I was even able to see the Hostock rising 3,160 meters high. There it was, straight before me, the second highest mountain of the whole range. Only cloud-hidden Todi being higher. It was also the whitest of them all. It rose up like a tremendous pyramid, and its triangular summit seemed to be walled off by a gigantic, perfectly smooth wall of rock on which the snow could not rest. It stretched across the whole peak. Do you remember when she came across the pyramid in her journey in the desert? It filled me with a new thrill as it spoke forth a new lesson, reminding me of the great and astonishing differences there are in the lives and circumstances of people everywhere around the world. For example, the Ortstock, which dominates the scene from Braunwald, is far and away the most picturesque mountain in sight. With its 7 rocky peaks rising one above the other, it beckons to higher places all the time. It is my special mountain. I love it, for somehow it seems to picture my own adventurous and in some ways out of the ordinary kind of life. Constantly, I have been challenged to new adventures and leaps to new heights of faith. Moreover, the Brumbach and the Zilbach Falls leap down the mountain sides. But as the people at the table in the pension house remarked, the Ortstock is the most picturesque and perhaps the most spectacular of the group of mountains, but it does not rise to such heights as do many of the others. Yes, there are some lives that tower up to far more sublime heights than others, which may appear more showy and spectacular. My beloved Ortstock does not soar so very high, beautiful though it is. It came to me with great comfort and peace as I walked along the path, that privileged and unusual as my lot is, to live and work in Jerusalem at the time of Israel's return to the ancient homeland. Wow. Yet I am still very small fry. The task I am called to is small compared to others, though my life is adventurous and exciting. But there are other lives in circumstances much less picturesque to look at. I hear a little noise. I don't know where it's coming from. Far greater heights of obedience and faith and self-surrender. They may appear to have very uneventful slopes and no outstanding peaks until the summit is reached. But oh, how majestically they show forth their Lord's glory when that summit is reached. After a brief, breathless scramble, I came to the Riot Alps slopes where the cow chalets are. By then, a fine rain had started to fall. How sudden the changes of weather are out here. I find no one bold enough to forecast whether it will be fine or not. I gathered some of the huge gentians which grow in the Riot Alp, and then sought shelter under the eaves of a cowshed and hoped for the rain to stop. But soon it was clear that the clouds were descending in every direction, and there was no hope that the rain would end. I hurried down the steep track before the rain would make it dangerously slippery. Then for an hour I walked home through a steady, persistent downpour. The temptation came to repine and resent the rain and to long for sunshine. Now, see, that's what I would do, I think. I'm already pining away that summer is gone, almost gone. She says, but I remembered the message given me by dear friends who had met me at the Zurich airport. Go through each day praising and thanking God for everything that happens. Nothing can take from me the memories and beauties and lessons of these 3 days. So I praised as I walked through the steady downpour, and soon I found that the rain and the clouds and the mist were also sounding forth messages from my Lord. How suddenly the change had come. One moment I was gazing almost breathlessly at the beauty of the Hostok as the clouds lifted from it for the first time. Then just half an hour later, all the snow mountains were blotted out, as completely as if they didn't exist. Before I got back to the Bergfrieden pension house, all the nearer hills and fields and chalets had disappeared, and mist and rain completely shrouded the landscape. Then my Lord said, these changes come in life too. For 1 hour, the vision on the mount, and then perhaps almost directly, the descent into the depths of the valley, where the vision may seem to be completely blotted out by changed circumstances. But believe steadfastly in what I showed you in the hours of vision and clear sky. The reality is still there, even though a curtain seems to blot it out. You have seen the housetop, and though there is no trace of it now, and it has disappeared like a dream, nevertheless, it is there. It is a reality. But the mist and cloud are transient, and they will pass away, and the true reality will appear again. A lovely message indeed, even though the feeling was a rather miserable one of extreme wetness. I reached the pension house sopping wet, changed into a new outfit of dry clothes, and verily the riot elk did seem to have disappeared as though out of existence. But there in a vase on my table were the gentians which I had picked on its slopes. I may not be able to show anyone the riot elk at present, nor the vision that God gave me yesterday, but the riot elk is certainly here, as my gentians testify. And the purposes and plans which God showed me and his pattern also remain true. These little notebooks with their records of what he made me see are like the gentians, a visible testimony to the eye of faith. Next is Ascension Day, ascent to the highest. Now it is all breathtakingly beautiful, although when I awoke it was cloudier than ever, and my precious 2 weeks are nearly half finished already. But as I lie on the bed, the great snow peaks opposite are all shining in the morning light, and the sky is blue. The clouds are no longer gray and heavy, but are white and fluffy. The cowbells are tinkling, the sun is shining, and now the deaconess sisters are going from room to room singing Ascension Day hymns. They have just stood at my bedroom door and sung, of course, in Swiss German. Now we sing with the great multitude, Alleluia. Oh yes, Lord Jesus, amen. This morning everything is uttering forth your praise as the mist upon the peaks rolls away and the light is like the shining of your face. And Moses went up into the mount, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And the 7th day he called unto Moses out of the midst of the cloud. That's from Exodus 24, verses 15 and 16. It is the 7th day since my arrival, and the first perfectly fine one. The mountains stand out clearly against a cloudless blue sky. As I came down the slopes of the Braunwald Alp from my special trysting place with the loving Lord, the Sesselbahn chairs came swinging down the overhead cables, one after another. And there, to my consternation, laughing and gesticulating excitedly over my head, were ever so many of the Bergfrieden sisters. The lady who sits at the same table with me was also there. She had said she would go with me up to the Eckstock that afternoon if it were fine, but evidently I had left the house too early to hear of the change of plans, and they had all gone up that morning without me. I had been left behind. So if I wanted to go up to those terrifying Sesselbahn chairs which so fascinated me, I must venture in them alone. Oh my goodness. Once again, a great temptation to feel disappointed leaped at me. And then I found myself praising the Lord and deciding to go alone. Yes, I, who am so afraid of heights and cannot persuade myself even to go up to a church tower or look out of a high-storied building, and who had been so horrified at the first sight of the aerial chairs, was now actually longing to go and to be carried up to the heights in a dizzy-looking dangling seat. So after lunch, I hurried off to the Cecilbahn station. I was afraid of being afraid, but a strange, exultant urge was upon me. For the Cecilbahn, as a picture of God's promises, had been such an inspiration to me these last days that I felt I must trust myself to it, in actual fact, almost as an outward sign of my inner surrender to God's future plans and purposes. When I got to the station, a real shock awaited me. The man said that something had gone wrong with the electric cable at the top of the mountain, and they were going to stop the ascent and descent of the chairs. But if I liked, I could go up when the last people got down in a short time and then wait up on the heights while the cable was put right. Even the news that the cable was not in order did not deter me, for I was so afraid that it would rain again the next day. But when I found that no one else was going up, and I would be swinging there in the chairs all alone, it did make me falter. 6 Swiss women had just come along and looked at the chairs and the cable and the heights. They said they were afraid to go and advised me not to go either. I too turned and started to go away, but the man ran after me and said that the chairs were just coming down. So I went back and waited. Then another woman and a girl came along and said they would make the ascent too. At 2:24, we stepped into the chairs. As there were only 3 of us going up and the woman and the girl were together in one pair of chairs, I was put in the first pair. An empty seat was beside me. I was all alone. The workman who was to repair the line in the station on the peak, who had been swung off first. Quite a wide space is left between each pair of chairs. I sat and watched him start off and waited for my turn. My heart beat rather tumultuously, but I was astonished to find how calm I felt. I had told myself that I, who was so terrified of heights and big drops, could not possibly go in the Cecilbahn. Yet here I was, without a companion to talk to me and reassure me and put a protecting hand over my arm, sitting in the chair and waiting to be swung off toward the high places. The whole thing had now become a symbol of the abandonment of faith, and I couldn't turn back. The station attendant grinned at me. The girl in the chair behind me giggled nervously, and they all cried out, "Auf Wiedersehen! Goodbye till we meet again." Then the man pulled a handle, and my chair ran forward outside the station. For the next 15 minutes, I would be able to do nothing to stop or prevent myself from being swung high in the air and up and over a terrifying looking precipice. There was nothing I could do, even if I panicked. There I must sit or throw myself out of the seat. Remember, much afraid, kept thinking that she was going to get so panicked that she would throw herself off the mountain. The chairs simply shoot out from the station at great speed, I suppose in order to get a good swing upward, like an airplane rushing along the ground just before takeoff. But once outside and high on the line, the running is beautifully smooth and steady. It was wonderful. The green slopes beneath were gold and blue with buttercups and gentians, and snow peaks towered all around. Going up the line, the chairs do not face the precipice, but look out on the mountains of the other side of the valley. Coming down, one faces the Ortstock and the Eckstock and its great precipice. Up and up we went, and the height did not seem dreadful at all. Just for one moment, after swinging over my usual prayer place and reaching the ravine with its huge, jagged rocks, I did feel a slightly odd feeling, which I knew if I gave way to it would lead to real panic. The thought, "Oh, I can't stop and get out even if I want to," sprang into my mind. I gripped the armrest and gasped, "The Lord is my shepherd. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. That's Psalm 23, of course. Then the feeling of panic passed instantly, and from that moment I was swung upward, almost in an ecstasy of delight, as the marvelously beautiful views opened before me. The valleys and slopes were left behind, and the mountains were all around, their peaks drawing nearer and nearer. I could see the chairs with the woman and girl coming up some distance behind me. My back was to the precipice, and my face was toward the peaks. Then the precipice was actually underneath, and there were higher, green, flowered-covered slopes. Yet still we ran up, and then the terminus actually became visible. With a rattle, my chair dipped and ran into a long, dark shed, and a man, looking rather surprised to see a woman quite alone, pulled the chairs to a standstill, and I stepped out. The overhead power had carried me to the top. Well, there's quite a bit more here, and I don't want to make you all tired. So maybe I will finish the rest of it next week. There's no specific order that I have to do this all in, is there? Hallelujah. I'm going to read one poem to you from Hinds, which is my favorite poem, and it's from Isaiah 54. And then we'll close. O thou afflicted, tempest tossed, in sorrow's pathway led, behold, thy suffering is not lost. Thou shalt be comforted. In fairest colors thou shalt shine, and precious jewels shall be thine. Foundation stones of bright sapphires shall garnish all thy floors. Thy ruby windows glow like fires, and emeralds make thy doors. And all thy walls and borders be of precious stones and porphyry. Fear not, thy trust ends not in loss. I'll not put thee to shame. There is a purpose in thy cross, and no reproach or blame. One day, with glad, exultant voice, thou, child of sorrow, shall rejoice. Stretch forth the curtains of thy tent, lengthen the cords, spread wide. Strengthen thy stakes with great content, break forth on every side. Thine anguish is no barren birth. Thou shalt have seed throughout all the earth. That's from Isaiah 54, 11 and 12. What a lovely, lovely poem. Well, I did more reading than sharing this week, but I think those are all good lessons to think about, to meditate on. You can meditate on some of these lessons as you're waiting before the Lord this week and see what he speaks to you. And remember, he can speak in many different ways, including nature, including his word. So I just want to bless all of you and say I love you, and I'll see you next week. And if the Lord puts it on your heart to give, I would be very, very thankful. Bye now.